Thanks, Steve. So for anybody who's on here who may not know me, my name is Alex Van Pelt. I am the state NFIP coordinator with the Kentucky Division of Water. NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program, and I'm going to kind of give everyone a quick rundown of the floodplain world or the floodplain universe as it exists here in the Commonwealth. So, quick outline, we're going to talk why do we care about floodplains? We're going to do a quick overview of what is the National Flood Insurance Program and how does it work. We're going to talk about federal, state, and local roles in floodplain management. We're going to quickly cover some of the other stakeholders, and then we are going to talk about mitigation funding and funding sources there at the end. And hopefully, we'll have a couple minutes for questions. So, why do we care about floodplains? From a management standpoint, when we're talking about development in the floodplains, what we're really focused on is floodplains are inherently dangerous areas. They offer a bunch of great natural benefits, but when it comes to human use, people love to build there. But that area is flat and near water for a reason. It's because it's the area that wants to flood the most. It's at highest risk levels of a flood occurring. Um, from 96 to 2017, Kentucky had 78 flood deaths in that 21-year span. And that's a significant amount because Kentucky, we only account for about 1% of the U.S. population, but that total accounted for about 4% of the fatalities in that time frame. And as you can see from the map there at the bottom, there's not one area of the state that is more at risk than any others. So when we're talking about floodplain management, it is a Commonwealth-wide, um, issue that needs to be addressed. So historically, the way human beings dealt with floodwaters is they focused on controlling the water. We're controlling where it can and where it cannot go. So humans historically have built dams, levees and flood walls, reservoirs, and they have done channel modifications to try and control where the water goes. But at a certain point, we realized that this was a losing battle. It's too costly and too expensive to build and maintain these. And then you can have larger than expected events that can, essentially negate any benefit you're getting with this. So in 1968, Congress put together the National Flood Insurance Program. It's a voluntary program that is essentially a agreement between a local community and the federal government. Local communities, they agree to adopt and enforce a floodplain management ordinance. In return, the federal government makes federally backed flood insurance available to all property owners throughout that community. Big picture goal is they want to reduce flood damages. And it aims to do this through a couple ways. So, one, we need to know where our high risk areas are. So, this would be developing our flood maps. Once we know that where those are, what are we going to make people do to protect themselves in these high risk areas? That's regulating our floodplain development. No matter how high you set those development standards, there's always going to be a residual level of risk that exists. So, providing insurance to cover that residual risk in the event that something unfortunate happens. And then the last one is mitigating existing flood risk. There have been European settlers living in the Commonwealth since the 1700s. We've only been managing floodplains since about the mid 60s. So, what do we do about everything that was already currently in place when this program came about? Well, we mitigate, we take an action to reduce that flood risk. Best way to think about the program is as a four-legged stool. You really have to have all four um, components working properly to hold it up. So, what are some of the roles when we're talking about floodplain management that are played? There are many federal agencies that all play a part in flood risk management at the federal level. You have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They are the nation's engineers. They are tasked with, regulatory management. They are tasked with doing planning and flood risk management at the federal level. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They're our nation's first responders. So when you see news footage of a hurricane, FEMA is typically the ones boots on the ground doing response and recovery operations there in the community. They're also tasked with mitigation, so again, reducing that flood risk, as well as planning. So what are some of the mitigation options that are available out there? EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they are the nation's regulators essentially. They regulate actions and activities that affect clean water and drinking water. USGS, they are nation scientists. They are the ones who install and maintain our stream gauges across the nation. They collect lots and lots of data. And then for flood risk management, they are also doing flood inundation mapping. National Weather Service, they are our nation's weathermen. They are doing flood forecasts, whether that be 1 day out, 3 days out, a month at a time, seasonally, or even annually every year. And then they are also tracking weather events. So where's rain falling? And then once it falls, how does it flow across the ground? And then the last one is HUD, Housing and Urban Development. They are our nation's housing department. They're tasked with overseeing housing and infrastructure. Moving down into the state roles. Kentucky Emergency Management, they are essentially Kentucky's state FEMA analog. They are tasked with many of the same operations that FEMA is. So again, response and recovery, boots on the ground when a disaster is occurring, or recovering after it's happened. They oversee the mitigation grant programs that FEMA oversees in the Commonwealth, and then they do a lot of the hazard mitigation planning. DLG, that's the Department for Local Government. They are a state HUD analog. They're again tasked with housing and infrastructure. But DLG also does some additional planning, and they actually have an additional funding structure, which we're going to talk about later, that may be available depending on your projects. And then the last one is Division of Water, or DOW. They are the state EPA analog, but there's also parts of FEMA tasks that Division of Water oversees. DOW is a regulatory agency. So, we don't respond when the disaster happens, but we regulate what is being done to make sure it complies with federal and state regulations. DOW does some planning, some infrastructure and environmental planning. And then, we look at natural hazards, so flooding, drought, things of that nature. State programs, they're set up largely to support federal and local programs. So again, most of those are emulating something that's being done at the federal level. Who's actually conducting the work might be a little different. They're not completely the same, but as you could have seen from those last two slides, they have a lot of overlap. States provide additional technical and administrative services to communities. So we are the technical experts for the local communities when they're wanting to go in and do projects. But then we also provide guidance to FEMA, for example, after a flood happens, when they come in and start recovery operations on what the state and local requirements are to make sure that they are able to comply with all of those. And again, flood risk management wise, the three main state partners are Kentucky Division of Water, Kentucky Emergency Management, and Kentucky Department for Local Government. Local responsibilities. So the local community has final regulatory authority over all projects that happen in their jurisdiction. So they all have a local floodplain management ordinance if their community is part of the NFIP. The reason it was done that way is because, at the state level, we have a lot of resources that a majority of communities do not have. We have engineers on staff, we have modeling software, we have mapping experts, we have the technical experts. But we give the local communities that final authority because they are able to adopt more stringent requirements that may not be applicable statewide. And this, gives them the final say and it allows them to reduce their community's risk as a whole. Um, as I said before, the NFIP is a voluntary program. Not all communities participate. Here in Kentucky, 350 or so of the 400 communities, so that would be unincorporated county areas or incorporated cities, participate in the NFIP. So there are some who don't, but a majority of the Commonwealth has a local floodplain coordinator at the local level. So they are essentially me, but for their specific community. They are there to help community members identify if they're in the floodplain, help them comply with the federal and state requirement, or excuse me, the state and local requirements, and then they do enforcement actions, public outreach, things of that nature. If you want to find a local floodplain coordinator, we actually have them posted on our website, but the web address is very, very long. So if you just Google local floodplain coordinator Kentucky, it should be the first or second result in Google that actually gives you our list of who all the locals are. Other stakeholders when it comes to floodplain management, so there are some additional ones. The one that is one of the largest is going to be the lenders. They are required by law to ensure that if you have a home, for example, in a floodplain and someone buys it with a federally backed mortgage, the lender is required to make that borrower carry flood insurance to cover their potential losses. Um, so they are very key when it comes to enforcing that insurance requirement. Um, you know, um, they're required to use the existing maps. This is something we hear a lot from local property owners is the maps are wrong. Well, we're required by law to use the maps. You can actually have them updated. If somebody's interested in that, please point them to me. I'm happy to assist. But yet, lenders use the floodplain maps that we talked about earlier to enforce that insurance requirement. Another big one is the insurance agents themselves. Again, they're required to use the effective floodplain maps when it comes to rating that policy. So your insurance policy for flood is based on your risk levels. Um, so if you are living in a floodplain flat on the ground and we expect the water level to get 4 feet, above ground level, you have several feet of your home at risk, and it's going to be very expensive to go in and fix that. So the insurance agents use the maps and some other basic information to rate policies. Um, Elevation certificates are always great to have as a property owner point of view because it tells you exactly where your house sits in relation to that flood elevation. So you can very clearly see whether you are below base flood elevation, which is how high we expect the water to get, whether you're above it, right at it, whatever. It tells you exactly where your house sits and what your risk level is. And then the final big one is private citizens, so the property owners, the business owners, etc. Flood insurance really is there to make them whole. When a flood happens, homeowners insurance or other property insurance does not cover flooding. It specifically excludes it. So having flood insurance really does put you back. In 2017, during Hurricane Harvey, people that had flood insurance, their average claim was about $113,000, whereas the average individual assistance grant that came in when the disaster happened was about $4,200. And that is individual assistance grant was a loan. They expected that money back. So flood insurance really is important, especially in those really high risk areas. Um, and again, insurance is available to everyone in that participating community, regardless of if you're in the floodplain or not. If anywhere it rains, it can flood. So there are preferred risk policies out there that homeowners can get. And then the last thing I want to talk about on this, when we're talking about floodplain management and flood risk, is the community rating system. So the NFIP is a voluntary program. This is also a voluntary program that works on top of that. So it recognizes community activities that go above and beyond the minimum requirements. So here in Kentucky, we only make people build at or above the flood elevation. So whatever that number is for where you want to build, we would just make you build at or above it. Whereas the CRS program would actually recognize communities that say, no, we want you to build 1 foot or 2 feet higher or something like that. The way it works is it's a points-based program. So whatever actions you take, whether that be education and outreach, open space, green infrastructure, um, freeboard requirements, higher building standards, things like that. Whatever actions you take earn points, and every 500 points is one CRS class improvement. Every CRS class you go up, you get an additional 5% reduction on flood insurance premiums. So the best example in Kentucky is Louisville Metro. They are a CRS class 3, and as you can see from the chart on the right side, a class 3 gets a 35% reduction on flood insurance premiums simply because of what Louisville Metro is doing in their flood risk management program. So it's a great benefit to communities to really help their citizens. If you want to know more about CRS, you can contact me, or you can contact Christina Groves. She is the Kentucky CRS specialist, and her email is there. Okay, and the last part I want to talk about while we're here is I think the part that's going to be most beneficial to some of the basin coordinators, and that's the mitigation funding or the funding mechanisms for projects. So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to cover several different funding options or funding programs very briefly. If you want to know more, please reach out to me. But the first one is the one people are most familiar with when it comes to floodplain management, and that is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. This is a post-disaster grant program that is designed to help communities after a flood event or after a disaster implement mitigation measures. So, for example, if there was, in February of this year, actually, we had a disaster declaration here in Kentucky. Um, Whatever the final total is for that disaster declaration, 20% of that goes directly towards HMGP funding. So it typically funds projects such as acquisitions, so buying flooded properties and removing them from the floodplain, um, safe rooms, tornado shelters, generators, outreach programs. I believe we've had some for like green infrastructure in communities that were funded through HMGP. Funding levels vary depending on the size of the and number of the disasters. So, for example, in 2015, Kentucky had 4 declared disasters. So each one of those disasters, 20% of their funding went to HMGP grant, and it kind of varies. You know, there have been years where we have none, and there's been other years where we have several. So it just varies year to year. Typical breakdown in Kentucky with HMGP funding is 75% is federally funded. Kentucky is actually an enhanced state, so we provide 12% of the funding, and then local communities are responsible for that last 13%. And we're going to talk about ways they can cover that local funding here in a second. So HMGP, this is a post-disaster. This is after a disaster has occurred. There are 2 other pre-disaster grant programs out there. The first one is a brand new one. It's actually rolling out for the first time as we speak, and it's called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. The goal on this is to support communities through capacity and capability building, encouraging new developments, innovation, promoting partnerships, etc. We don't know a lot of the details on BRIC yet because again, it's brand new. The notice to funding opportunity, I believe, is slated to come out late summer, early fall this year. It is actually replacing an older grant called Predisaster Mitigation. And then the other one I want to talk about is flood mitigation assistance. This is also a pre-disaster grant. This one is geared towards reducing um, flood losses for structures that are insured by the NFIP. So this one is really for reducing potential flood insurance claims under the NFIP. Both of these grants are open annually, so once a year there will be a funding opportunity put out, and they're nationwide competitive. Give you an example is last year the FMA and the PDM grant, between those two there was $410 million available for projects and mitigations. Um, if you need help with any of these three FEMA grants that I've just talked about, the two people listed at the bottom, Jenny Jo Broner, she's our state hazard mitigation officer at Kentucky Emergency Management. Her office is tasked with ensuring that your grants comply with state and federal requirements and that they are eligible for the grant you're applying for. If you have projects in mind, but you really don't know whether or not they could be funded or what documentation or something like that that you may need, Esther White is a grants manager at UK. Her job is to work with applicants um, to provide the documentation and the cost benefit analysis and things like that to submit to Jenny Jo's office. So those are two really great resources if you want to talk about potential projects and documentation and things like that. A couple other mitigation funding. So increased cost of compliance. So if somebody has flood insurance and they're flooded, they can actually get an additional $30,000 on top of their insurance claim to do mitigation projects. So whether that be acquisition, demolition, and then turning it into a park or a walking path or something like that, there are additional dollars out there on top of their flood insurance claims. And then Kentucky actually has the flood control matching grant program, which is overseen by the Department for Local Government, DLG. Um, their role is to help communities meet their cost share match requirements that are associated with federal grants. So I mentioned earlier with an HMGP grant, 75% of the funding comes from the federal coffers, 12% comes from Kentucky, and then the final 13% is left for the local communities. DLG under this grant program can actually come in and cover 75% of that local requirement. So I've actually seen projects before where a $100,000 house, for example, is acquired in the floodplain. $75,000 comes from FEMA, 12,000 from Kentucky, almost $10,000 from the Department of Local Government, leaving the local community on the hook for just over $4,000. So it really is easy to do some of these grants using these three different pots of funding, and it puts minimal burden then on the community. And the last couple opportunities I want to talk about are more outside of my wheelhouse, but I know that I think the grant, or excuse me, the basin coordinators would be interested in. And that's going to be there are several EPA grants out there specifically for green infrastructure projects that include stormwater and green infrastructure. Stormwater projects for me as a floodplain manager are great because stormwater becomes floodwater. Stormwater is before it gets to the creeks and starts flooding. So the more stormwater projects that are out there, typically the better for me when it comes to the mapping and the regulation side. Small Business Association, they actually offer low interest disaster loans to businesses, private nonprofits, homeowners, renters, etc. after a flood. These are becoming more and more common as disasters are getting larger. So this can help people, replace stock or inventory. It can help them help individuals essentially recover and protect themselves from flooding. And then the HUD 203K loan program allows for mitigation actions. So if you go to a bank and take out a typical loan, there's a loan to value ratio that you have to meet. So you have to add a certain amount of value to your property to obtain that loan. And that's difficult when all you're doing is mitigating because you're not really adding anything, you're just protecting what you have. So this loan program actually allows you to get around those value ratios and take activities or take action for structural alterations, reconstruction, things like that. Again, on any of these mitigation programs, if you want to know more, please reach out to me. This is my contact info, as well as my boss, Sean. Either one of us can answer any questions or anything like that you may have. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.